Antoninus Pius, one of the so-called five good emperors of Rome, ascended the throne in 138 CE, following the death of Hadrian. Unlike his predecessors, Antoninus did not earn fame through military conquest or flamboyant displays of power. Instead, his reign became a model of stability, justice, and administrative excellence. From the moment he became emperor, Antoninus Pius committed himself to ensuring that the Roman Empire continued to thrive, guided by the wisdom of his adoptive father Hadrian, whose careful succession planning had selected him as the next ruler. His epithet, Pius, reflected his devotion, not only to Hadrian as his adoptive father, but also to the Roman gods, the Senate, and the people of the empire. The early life of Antoninus Pius set the stage for his remarkable capacity for governance. Born as Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Aureus Antoninus in 86 CE, into a wealthy and well-established Roman senatorial family, he received a careful education in rhetoric, philosophy, and law. The young Antoninus was noted for his intelligence, prudence, and moral integrity, qualities that would later define his imperial persona. By the time he entered public life, he had gained extensive experience as a senator and magistrate, and his reputation for fairness and loyalty attracted the attention of Hadrian, who saw in him a reliable and steady heir. When Antoninus Pius became emperor, the Roman Empire was at the height of its territorial expansion. Yet Hadrian had begun a shift from conquest to consolidation. The empire was largely secure, but tensions remained along the frontiers in Britain, Germany, and the Danube region. Unlike his predecessor, Antoninus Pius rarely took to the battlefield. He relied on capable generals and governors to maintain the military and focused his personal attention on governance, justice, and public welfare. This approach earned him admiration both in Rome and across the provinces. Under his leadership, Rome experienced one of the longest periods of peace in its history, sometimes referred to as the Pax Antoniniana, a time of unprecedented stability and prosperity. One of the defining characteristics of Antoninus Pius's reign was his commitment to law and justice. He expanded and refined the legal reforms initiated by Hadrian, ensuring that Roman law became more consistent and equitable. He was deeply concerned with fairness in the courts, the treatment of slaves, and the administration of provincial governors. Antoninus personally intervened in legal cases where injustice had occurred, and he promoted legislation to protect the rights of widows, orphans, and the less fortunate. His devotion to justice was so thorough that contemporary historians often described him as a ruler who governed not with fear or force, but through reason, moral authority, and fairness. Antoninus Pius was also a careful administrator, attentive to the needs of the empire's infrastructure and economy. He maintained roads, aqueducts, and harbors, ensuring the movement of goods and military forces remained efficient. He supported cities with public works, including temples, theaters, and baths, which not only demonstrated imperial generosity, but also strengthened loyalty among the provincial populations. Trade and commerce flourished under his rule, as peace across the empire allowed agricultural, industrial, and commercial activities to thrive. His reign represents a rare moment in Roman history when administration, justice, and prosperity were prioritized above military ambition, leaving behind a lasting legacy of governance. Religious devotion was another important aspect of Antoninus Pius's life. True to his title, Pius, he was deeply respectful of Roman religious traditions. He performed all required religious ceremonies with dedication and encouraged civic religion across the provinces. Temples were built and restored under his patronage, and festivals continued to unite the empire through shared cultural and religious practices. Antoninus himself avoided ostentatious displays of personal power, preferring to embody humility and moral rectitude. In this way, he earned the respect of the Senate and the people, who saw him as a ruler who placed duty above personal glory. Despite the lack of military conquests, Antoninus Pius had to contend with occasional unrest along the borders. In Britain, Hadrian's wall had established a secure frontier, but the northern tribes still posed threats. Antoninus commissioned the construction of the Antonine Wall, north of Hadrian's Wall, to extend Roman control further into Caledonia, modern Scotland. This wall, although less celebrated than its predecessor, demonstrated his attention to strategic defense and the security of Roman Britain. Similarly, in Germania and along the Danube, he maintained garrisons and ensured that local revolts or incursions were swiftly suppressed, though always with the goal of minimizing widespread bloodshed. His approach emphasized measured responses rather than outright conquest, reinforcing the image of a ruler who valued order and stability above expansion. Education and culture also flourished under Antoninus Pius. He patronized scholars, poets, and philosophers, continuing the tradition of Hadrian in maintaining Rome as a center of intellectual life. Public libraries, philosophical discussions, and literary pursuits thrived, contributing to the cultural richness of the empire. Antoninus encouraged the study of Greek literature and philosophy alongside traditional Roman learning, promoting a fusion of cultures that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of his empire. The emperor himself was considered a learned man, and his correspondence and decrees reveal careful reasoning, moral concern, and attention to detail. Antoninus Pius's personal life, though private, further reinforced his image as a stable and pious ruler. He married Faustina the Elder, who became a trusted partner and advisor, and together they were seen as a model imperial couple. Faustina herself was remembered for her charitable works and her support for Roman women and children. The couple's family life provided an example of virtue and stability, contrasting with the tumultuous personal affairs of many earlier emperors. Although they had no surviving sons, Antoninus and Faustina adopted Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, ensuring continuity and strengthening the empire's long-term governance. The emperor's policies and demeanor created a climate of respect and loyalty across the empire. Coinage, inscriptions, and monuments celebrated his virtues: piety, justice, moderation, and peacefulness. Unlike rulers who relied on fear or spectacle, Antoninus Pius cultivated a moral authority that ensured obedience without resentment. Contemporary historians, such as Cassius Dio, praised his moderation and the harmony of his reign. Cities across the provinces honored him with statues and inscriptions, reflecting the widespread approval of his leadership. Economically, the empire benefited from Antoninus Pius's prudence. Taxes were collected fairly, provincial revenues were used for public works, and corruption was minimized through oversight and careful appointments. Trade routes remained secure, allowing goods, ideas, and culture to flow freely across the Mediterranean and beyond. Farmers, artisans, and merchants prospered, contributing to a sense of social stability that underpinned the political order. The combination of peace, justice, and economic prudence made Antoninus Pius's reign one of the most prosperous periods in Roman history. In summary, the early period of Antoninus Pius's reign laid the foundation for one of the most stable and prosperous eras in the Roman Empire. While lacking the military exploits of previous emperors, his careful administration, dedication to justice, devotion to religion, and cultural patronage ensured that Rome remained strong, united, and prosperous. The emperor's moral authority, rather than fear or force, defined his leadership, making him a model of good governance. His strategic foresight in securing succession and fostering loyalty across provinces preserved the empire's stability, setting the stage for the rule of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Antoninus Pius's story, therefore, is not one of dramatic battles or epic conquests, but of quiet strength, intellectual engagement, and steadfast devotion to duty. His reign demonstrated that an emperor could wield immense power responsibly, ensuring that Rome's institutions, culture, and people thrived in harmony. By the end of this first part of his life as emperor, Antoninus had established a framework of peace, justice, and prosperity that would influence the empire long after his death. His legacy, built on stability, moral authority, and foresight, would become a benchmark for what a good emperor should be, a standard admired by both contemporaries and historians alike. Antoninus Pius, during the second phase of his reign, focused on consolidating the achievements of his early years, while attending to the subtler challenges of imperial governance. By this stage, he had established a reputation as a just, stable, and prudent ruler, and his administration increasingly became a model of Roman efficiency and moral authority. While previous emperors often sought glory on the battlefield, Antoninus recognized that true greatness could also be achieved through the careful management of resources, the promotion of culture, and the maintenance of peace across a sprawling and diverse empire. His attention to detail in matters of administration, law, and provincial oversight allowed the Roman Empire to flourish economically and socially, even without dramatic military campaigns or conquests. One of the most important aspects of this period of Antoninus' rule was his careful attention to the provinces, ensuring that Rome's distant territories remained loyal and well-governed. Governors and magistrates were closely monitored, and Antoninus personally reviewed reports to prevent abuses of power. Unlike some of his predecessors, who relied primarily on military might to assert control, he relied on a combination of law, diplomacy, and administrative oversight. This approach earned him respect among provincial elites and helped reduce the risk of rebellion or unrest. Cities such as Antioch, Alexandria, and Ephesus continued to thrive under his oversight, with public works, marketplaces, and temples reflecting both Roman authority and local traditions. Antoninus understood that the stability of the empire depended as much on economic prosperity and cultural cohesion as on military strength. Antoninus' reign is particularly noted for its legal reforms and commitment to justice. Building on the foundation laid by Hadrian, he expanded protections for citizens and subjects across the empire. The emperor took a special interest in cases involving minors, widows, orphans, and slaves, ensuring that laws were applied fairly and compassionately. He commissioned legal scholars to codify and clarify Roman law, reducing inconsistencies and ambiguities that had previously led to corruption or injustice. By standardizing legal procedures, Antoninus strengthened the authority of the imperial administration while fostering trust among Rome's diverse populations. These reforms contributed to a sense of fairness and stability that became a hallmark of his reign, reinforcing the perception of the emperor as a morally upright and competent ruler. During this period, Antoninus Pius also oversaw significant economic and infrastructural development. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts were repaired and expanded to ensure efficient transportation of goods, troops, and communications. Ports and harbors were maintained, facilitating trade across the Mediterranean and beyond. Agriculture prospered under his administration, thanks to fair tax policies and the protection of landowners. The emperor understood that economic stability was crucial for maintaining social order and preventing unrest. Public works were not merely utilitarian. They were also symbolic, demonstrating the power, generosity, and cultural sophistication of Rome. Markets, theaters, baths, and temples served both practical and ceremonial functions, reflecting Antoninus' vision of an empire in which prosperity and culture were inseparable. The emperor's dedication to peace and diplomacy became another defining feature of his reign during this period. While wars had defined the careers of many previous emperors, Antoninus largely avoided large-scale military campaigns. He maintained strong garrisons along the empire's frontiers, but emphasized negotiation, diplomacy, and strategic alliances whenever possible. Relations with neighboring peoples, including the Germanic tribes and communities along the Danube, were carefully managed to prevent conflict. Antoninus' approach reflected a deep understanding of the limits of military power and the value of stability. His reign stands out as one of the few periods in Roman history when the empire could enjoy prosperity without the constant drain of warfare. One of the most ambitious projects of this phase of Antoninus' reign was the construction of the Antonine Wall in Britain, extending the frontier north of Hadrian's Wall. While not as famous as its predecessor, the Antonine Wall demonstrated the emperor's concern for strategic defense and his pragmatic approach to military planning. Unlike Hadrian, who had focused on a static boundary, Antoninus sought to create a flexible defense system capable of responding to incursions while also integrating local populations into the empire. The wall itself, constructed primarily of turf and timber, stretched across central Scotland, providing a visible marker of Roman authority and serving as a base for controlling northern tribes. Its construction reflected the emperor's careful balance between security, cost, and practicality. Culturally, Antoninus Pius continued to promote intellectual and artistic life across the empire. Scholars, poets, and philosophers enjoyed his patronage, and public libraries and centers of learning flourished in Rome and the provinces. The emperor himself was deeply interested in philosophy, particularly Stoicism, which emphasized moral duty, self-discipline, and rational governance. His philosophical orientation influenced his approach to leadership, encouraging fairness, moderation, and careful deliberation. Unlike emperors who sought to impress through spectacle or brutality, Antoninus relied on reason, ethical conduct, and intellectual engagement to strengthen the legitimacy of his rule. Religion and piety also remained central to Antoninus' identity and policies. True to his epithet pious, he maintained a careful devotion to Roman religious traditions, performing rituals honoring the gods and restoring temples throughout the empire. These acts were not merely ceremonial. They reinforced social cohesion, legitimized imperial authority, and demonstrated the emperor's personal virtue. Festivals, sacrifices, and public observances under his direction continued to unite Rome's diverse populations and fostered loyalty to the emperor as both a political and spiritual leader. Antoninus' personal life during this period further reinforced his image as a moral and stable ruler. His wife, Faustina the Elder, played an essential role as a partner in governance and philanthropy. Together, they were involved in charitable work, providing support for orphanages, poor citizens, and veterans. Faustina's reputation for virtue complemented Antoninus' own, presenting a model of imperial family life grounded in duty, moral responsibility, and public service. Their domestic life, though private, was closely tied to their public image, demonstrating the emperor's commitment to embodying the values he promoted across the empire. Despite his largely peaceful reign, Antoninus had to address occasional unrest. Some frontier provinces, particularly in the north, experienced localized revolts or threats from neighboring tribes. These incidents were dealt with swiftly, but always with a focus on minimizing bloodshed and maintaining long-term stability. Antoninus' reliance on capable generals and careful administrative oversight ensured that these challenges never escalated into widespread conflict. By managing these crises with prudence and restraint, Antoninus demonstrated that effective leadership did not require constant warfare, but could be achieved through strategy, planning, and moral authority. By the end of this phase of his reign, Antoninus Pius had firmly established his reputation as a wise, just, and peaceful emperor. He maintained the boundaries of the empire, ensured the prosperity of its citizens, and promoted intellectual, cultural, and religious life. His policies reflected a deep understanding of the balance required to govern a vast, diverse empire effectively. While lacking the dramatic military achievements of predecessors like Trajan or Hadrian, Antoninus' rule demonstrated that stability, justice, and moral authority could be as powerful as any army in preserving and strengthening Rome. Antoninus Pius' legacy during this period also set the stage for the next generation of emperors. By adopting Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, he ensured a smooth transition of power and the continuation of the principles of good governance that had defined his reign. These adopted heirs would carry forward his vision of a stable, prosperous, and morally grounded empire, proving the enduring value of his policies and leadership style. In doing so, Antoninus Pius cemented his place among the 5 good emperors, remembered for his extraordinary capacity to govern effectively without resorting to conquest or tyranny. In summary, the second part of Antoninus Pius' reign highlights his commitment to peace, justice, culture, and administration. He transformed the role of emperor into one that emphasized moral authority, intellectual engagement, and careful governance. His rule serves as a model of leadership based on prudence, fairness, and devotion to duty, leaving a legacy that would influence the empire for decades and inspire admiration among historians and contemporaries alike. Antoninus Pius's reign is remembered by historians as one of the most peaceful and prosperous periods in the entire history of the Roman Empire. But within this era of calm, the emperor himself was deeply engaged in the steady process of shaping law, reinforcing tradition. As we move deeper into the life and reign of Antoninus Pius, we begin to see not only the subtlety of his leadership, but also the immense effect of his decisions on the empire, stability, legal traditions, and moral order. Unlike emperors who built their reputation through wars, conquest, or spectacle, Antoninus cultivated an image of fairness, patience, and measured governance. His genius lay not in battlefield victories, but in his ability to balance tradition with reform, preserve peace without appearing weak, and strengthen the empire's institutions without triggering resentment. Part 3 of his story reveals how his policies touched Roman law, provincial administration, religion, and public morality, while reinforcing the Pax Romana at a time when turmoil might otherwise have been expected. One of the most enduring legacies of Antoninus Pius was his immense contribution to Roman law. He was not a general writing battle reports or a conqueror inscribing triumphs. Rather, his name is found across legal rulings, imperial edicts, and judicial clarifications that helped solidify the principles of Roman jurisprudence. Antoninus took the Roman concept of equitas seriously, and he sought to make rulings that blended respect for precedent with compassion for the circumstances of individuals. For example, Antoninus issued decisions that provided greater protections for slaves, a groundbreaking step in Roman society where slavery was considered fundamental to the economic system. He ruled that masters could not simply kill their slaves with impunity. Cruel treatment and unjust execution by owners could be punished, marking a step toward humanizing the status of enslaved persons. Though slavery was not abolished and remained widespread, Antoninus's reforms reflected his sense of justice and his belief that power carried responsibilities. These rulings foreshadowed later legal developments in the empire and influenced jurists whose work would shape European law for centuries after Rome's fall. Equally important were his reforms for children and family life. Roman law had long granted fathers nearly absolute authority over their children, including power over life and death. Antoninus Pius sought to soften these harsh elements of patria potestas. His rulings restricted parental authority, protected the inheritance rights of children, and defended the vulnerable. In one case, he declared that an unwanted child could not be disinherited simply because of personal animosity. In another, he protected orphans and minors from exploitation by unscrupulous guardians. By doing so, Antoninus reinforced the idea that the emperor was the protector of justice for all, not merely a ruler of elites. Antoninus Pius's reign also reinforced the balance between imperial authority and senatorial dignity. He managed his relationship with the Senate in a way that both respected its traditions and confirmed the supremacy of the emperor. Unlike Domitian, who had alienated senators, or Hadrian, who sometimes clashed with them, Antoninus cultivated respect by consulting the Senate regularly, honoring its opinions, and avoiding overt humiliation of its members. He restored statues and honors to senators who had been disgraced under earlier emperors. This careful diplomacy reduced tensions and allowed Rome's aristocratic class to feel included in governance, even though ultimate power remained firmly in imperial hands. His style of leadership was thus more about inclusion and harmony than domination. This practice helped to prevent conspiracies, rebellions, or political instability, all of which had been frequent problems under earlier rulers. Religion also played a central role in the reign of Antoninus Pius. He was deeply respectful of traditional Roman religious practices, making regular offerings, attending ceremonies, and restoring temples. His piety was not superficial. Contemporaries viewed him as genuinely devout, and his respect for the gods gave him legitimacy among traditionalists. The cognomen Pius was not an empty title, but a reflection of his devotion to duty, family, and religion. At the same time, Antoninus displayed tolerance toward new and foreign religious movements, including Christianity. While Christians were not granted official protection, Antoninus Pius is said to have intervened on occasions to prevent harsh persecutions. Early Christian writers such as Eusebius suggest that Antoninus issued rescripts advising provincial governors not to persecute Christians unjustly. These rescripts did not end persecutions entirely, but they marked a more moderate stance compared to emperors like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius, who faced more violent outbreaks of hostility. In matters of foreign policy, Antoninus Pius demonstrated the same caution and patience that characterized his domestic governance. The empire's frontiers stretched thousands of miles, from Britain to Mesopotamia, and unrest always simmered on the borders. Yet Antoninus managed to preserve peace for nearly 2 decades without embarking on massive military campaigns. His philosophy was to defend, not to expand. This strategy was not born of weakness, but of wisdom. Rome had already reached the limits of sustainable expansion, and further wars could have drained resources and destabilized the empire. Instead of conquest, Antoninus invested in fortifications, roads, and garrisons that ensured the security of Rome's borders. For example, in Britain, he authorized the construction of the Antonine Wall, a massive fortification stretching across Scotland north of Hadrian's Wall. While the Antonine Wall was eventually abandoned, it represented the emperor's commitment to defense and his desire to demonstrate Rome as strength without committing to costly wars of expansion. The provinces under Antoninus Pius experienced relative prosperity and stability. Governors reported fewer uprisings, cities enjoyed autonomy, and local elites were encouraged to participate in Roman administration. Antoninus respected the traditions of the provinces while ensuring loyalty to Rome. He also continued Hadrian's policy of touring the empire through his officials rather than traveling personally. Unlike Hadrian, who journeyed across the provinces extensively, Antoninus remained in Italy throughout his reign, preferring to govern from Rome. Some critics saw this as a limitation, but it reflected his belief that stability and communication through trusted governors could maintain unity. Rome's roads, postal networks, and administrative machinery allowed Antoninus to manage distant affairs without leaving the capital, a testament to the efficiency of imperial administration at the height of Roman power. The prosperity of Antoninus's reign was also reflected in the empire's economy. Peace allowed trade routes to flourish across the Mediterranean and beyond. Roman merchants sailed to India, Arabia, and Africa, bringing back spices, silk, and precious gems. Grain from Egypt fed the population of Rome, while goods from Gaul, Spain, and Britain enriched the empire's markets. Taxes were collected efficiently, but not harshly, and Antoninus's fiscal policies were marked by generosity. He reduced burdens where possible, funded public works, and maintained a treasury that was both stable and secure. Unlike some emperors who lavished funds on spectacles or excessive wars, Antoninus invested in infrastructure, aqueducts, roads, harbors, and temples. These projects provided employment, improved trade, and displayed Roman power in a constructive way. Public morality under Antoninus Pius was guided by his personal character. He was renowned for his moderation, his avoidance of extravagance, and his sense of justice. Ancient sources describe him as calm, patient, and unwilling to act rashly. He lived modestly compared to emperors like Nero or Commodus, setting an example of restraint for Roman society. His devotion to his wife, Faustina the Elder, was also celebrated. When she died, Antoninus honored her with statues, temples, and coins, ensuring her memory endured throughout the empire. This public display of conjugal devotion reinforced Roman ideals of family loyalty and marital piety, strengthening his image as a moral and upright ruler. The personal habits of Antoninus further shaped his image. He was said to be approachable, gentle in conversation, and willing to listen to others. Unlike emperors who ruled through fear, Antoninus inspired respect through fairness and kindness. He rarely executed senators, avoided purges, and preferred clemency to cruelty. His reign thus became associated with justice and stability, a sharp contrast to the chaos that followed under later emperors. By embodying the virtues of a philosopher king, even without writing philosophical treatises himself, Antoninus Pius created an atmosphere in which Rome could thrive without fear. Yet, despite this peace, challenges simmered in the background. In distant provinces such as Judea, unrest occasionally flared, and tensions with Parthia required careful monitoring. Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube were restless, and the stability Antoninus preserved would later erupt into war under Marcus Aurelius. Critics might argue that Antoninus's avoidance of military campaigns left future emperors with unresolved problems. However, his restraint ensured that Rome did not exhaust itself prematurely. By leaving a strong treasury, a secure administration, and well-maintained frontiers, Antoninus provided his successors with the means to respond to future crises. By the end of Part 3 of his story, it is clear that Antoninus Pius embodied a style of leadership that was rare in Roman history. He avoided vanity, focused on fairness, and preserved stability not by force of arms, but by the force of character and law. His reign did not produce dramatic wars or monumental conquests, but it produced something arguably more valuable: 2 decades of peace in which the Roman world could breathe, prosper, and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. His legal reforms continued to resonate long after his death. His devotion to religion and morality reinforced Roman values, and his fairness in administration left an impression on contemporaries and historians alike. If Trajan was remembered as the conqueror and Hadrian as the traveler, Antoninus Pius became remembered as the guardian, the emperor who preserved Rome's strength through justice, patience, and piety. As the years of Antoninus Pius's reign stretched into their later stages, the emperor had already earned a reputation across the Roman world for his justice, moderation, and deep sense of duty. Having ruled longer than many of his predecessors, and avoiding the pitfalls of political intrigue or reckless military adventure, Antoninus had reached a place of authority where his decisions carried a gravity that was unquestioned. By the time he had governed for more than 2 decades, Rome had entered a period of sustained stability, and Antoninus Pius was increasingly seen as the embodiment of the philosophical ideal of the good ruler. Yet behind this veneer of stability, his later reign was not without difficulties. The old emperor, now burdened by age and the growing frailty of his health, was tasked with ensuring the future continuity of the empire and the preservation of his carefully nurtured peace. Antoninus Pius's later years were marked by a deliberate withdrawal from personal display of power. Unlike other emperors who grew more autocratic with age, he became almost more invisible, ruling through institutions, the Senate, and trusted governors rather than through dramatic public decrees. This style of governance gave him a reputation as the most senatorial of emperors, a ruler who respected the traditions of the republic, even while presiding over the imperial structure that had replaced it. He remained within Italy throughout his reign, never venturing abroad to oversee wars or provincial tours, an unprecedented decision for an emperor, and one that later historians debated intensely. Critics accused him of lacking vigor, of failing to leave Rome and personally deal with frontier threats, but others praised him for entrusting competent officials to manage those distant affairs, which allowed the empire to run with efficiency and without wasteful disruption. His approach reflected his fundamental belief that Rome was an enduring institution, and that the emperor's role was not to glorify himself with conquests, but to sustain the equilibrium of the state. Nevertheless, Rome's frontiers in his later reign did face pressure. In Britain, disturbances among northern tribes necessitated a strengthening of fortifications, and Antoninus famously authorized the construction of the Antonine Wall across central Scotland around 142 CE. Though initially successful, this frontier proved difficult to maintain, and eventually Roman forces retreated back to Hadrian's Wall. The episode, however, demonstrated Antoninus's willingness to respond pragmatically to challenges when needed. In the east, the empire maintained careful diplomacy with Parthia, the great rival state. While earlier emperors might have rushed to arms, Antoninus employed negotiation, gifts, and displays of Roman prestige to avoid conflict, ensuring that the balance of power remained intact without bloodshed. In Africa, he dealt with Moorish unrest through governors, again keeping himself detached but firmly in control. This consistent reliance on delegation was not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of his philosophy that Rome was larger than any single individual. In Rome itself, Antoninus continued to embody the paternal role that had earned him the name Pius. He sponsored numerous building projects that improved the lives of the people. His aqueduct repairs, the construction of temples, and the expansion of roads all contributed to the material welfare of the empire. Yet he did not seek grand monuments to his own glory in the style of earlier emperors like Trajan or Hadrian. His constructions were functional, often unadorned and practical. Even when he dedicated buildings, he emphasized their purpose in serving Rome rather than memorializing himself. This sense of modesty became one of the defining features of his reign, standing in stark contrast to emperors such as Nero or Domitian, whose self-indulgence had stained their legacies. Antoninus Pius's religious sensibilities also became more pronounced in his later years. Though firmly rooted in Roman tradition, he demonstrated remarkable tolerance toward various cults and philosophies. He allowed Christians a measure of peace compared to earlier periods of persecution, although he never formally embraced their beliefs. His reign saw fewer executions or dramatic crackdowns, reflecting his desire for civic harmony. In addition, he took seriously the role of Pontifex Maximus, maintaining Roman rituals with care, for he believed that the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was essential for the empire's stability. It is telling that later Christian writers, while critical of Roman paganism, often referred to Antoninus with respect for his fairness and moderation. One of the most significant aspects of Antoninus's later years was his relationship with his adopted sons, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Antoninus had no surviving biological sons, and thus the succession rested on the shoulders of these young men. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher destined to become one of Rome's greatest emperors, had been carefully guided under Antoninus's supervision. The older emperor fostered Marcus's intellectual and moral growth, allowing him to study philosophy, but also demanding his participation in public duties. By the 150 CE, Marcus was increasingly active in governance, serving as consul and taking part in Senate deliberations. Lucius Verus, younger and less inclined toward philosophy, was also prepared for a role, though Antoninus often viewed him as less capable than Marcus. By balancing these heirs, Antoninus ensured that Rome would avoid the destructive succession crisis that had plagued earlier emperors. His patience and foresight here became one of his greatest legacies, for the empire passed peacefully into the hands of prepared successors rather than descending into civil strife. As Antoninus aged into his late 70s, his health began to decline. Contemporary sources describe an old man who was still gentle, still wise, but increasingly weary of the burdens of rule. He continued to fulfill his duties with determination, attending Senate meetings, reviewing petitions, and issuing judgments even when his body failed him. His sense of responsibility was unwavering. He had been entrusted with Rome, and he would not abandon that duty until his final breath. The respect he commanded by this stage of his reign was immense. Senators, equestrians, soldiers, and common citizens alike looked upon him as the model of what an emperor could and should be. The final year of his reign was marked by a poignant awareness of mortality. Knowing that his time was near, Antoninus focused even more on securing the transition to Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. He gave them increasing responsibility, allowed them to share honors, and made clear to the Senate and the army that these men were his chosen heirs. This deliberate preparation ensured that his death would not create a vacuum of power. When illness overcame him in 161 CE at his villa in Lorium, Antoninus faced it with calm dignity. According to accounts, he summoned the golden statue of Fortuna, Rome's goddess of luck, and entrusted it to Marcus Aurelius, symbolically transferring Rome's fate to the next generation. His last words reportedly expressed simple trust in the young Marcus, saying to the guard commander, "Equanimity, now let us go." With those words, Antoninus Pius passed away peacefully, having ruled for nearly 23 years. The reaction to his death was profound. The Senate quickly deified him, granting him the title Divus Antoninus, and his widow Faustina was honored with the temple. His funeral was conducted with the full pomp of imperial ritual. Yet even in death, Antoninus was remembered more for his moderation than for grandeur. Temples, coins, and monuments commemorated him not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of peace. His reign had been free of major wars, rebellions, or tyrannies, something rare in the annals of Roman emperors. In many ways, he embodied the height of the so-called Pax Romana, the golden age of Roman peace, prosperity, and stability. Antoninus Pius's legacy extended far beyond his reign. Later historians, both Roman and modern, often struggled to write about him precisely, because his time lacked the drama of wars or scandals. His reign seemed uneventful compared to the conquests of Trajan or the philosophical writings of Marcus Aurelius. Yet this very uneventfulness was his greatest achievement. He proved that an emperor could govern effectively through moderation, through respect for tradition, and through fairness. His reign provided a model of continuity and harmony at a time when empire building and ambition had too often brought turmoil. In Marcus Aurelius's later meditations, the philosopher-emperor praised his adoptive father for his serenity, kindness, and ability to govern without cruelty, a testimony to the enduring influence of Antoninus's example. In the end, Antoninus Pius stood as one of the most unique emperors of Rome. He had not marched with legions. He had not reshaped the empire through conquest. He had not sought personal glory. Instead, he had maintained the peace, strengthened the institutions, and passed the empire on intact to capable successors. His reign showed that sometimes the greatest achievement of a ruler is not expansion but preservation. The Roman Empire under Antoninus Pius enjoyed a rare moment of balance, and in that balance lay the true greatness of his rule. Antoninus Pius entered the twilight of his reign with the same calm, disciplined, and methodical manner that had defined his entire rule. By the year 150 CE, he had already governed Rome for over a decade and a half, and his era had come to be seen by many Romans as a golden age of peace, justice, and stability. Unlike the tempestuous reigns of emperors before him, Antoninus Pius never marched with an army in the field, never embarked on conquests that filled the empire with triumphal arches and monuments, and never unleashed the kind of brutality that had plagued the later Julio-Claudians or Domitian. Instead, his rule was remembered for its steadiness, its attention to law, and its benevolent guardianship of the Roman world. Yet beneath the tranquil surface of his principate, Antoninus was fully aware that history never remained still. Time was constantly pressing forward, and no matter how peaceful and secure Rome seemed, threats, tensions, and inevitable change awaited beyond the horizon. By this stage of his reign, Antoninus had settled into his residence at his beloved villa at Lorium, near Rome. From this estate, he governed with an efficiency that astonished those who watched him work. He continued to rise early, hear petitions from across the empire, review accounts, and issue instructions to governors and provincial leaders. Letters and decrees continued to stream out from his office, shaping decisions in faraway provinces such as Britain, Syria, and Africa. Yet, while the administrative machine of empire seemed to hum smoothly under his direction, Antoninus was also aware of his own aging body. By the early 150 CE, he was already past 60 years of age, an advanced age by Roman standards. Despite his discipline in diet and lifestyle, the strain of ruling the greatest empire in the world had taken its toll. His once powerful frame had begun to show signs of decline, and though still vigorous in spirit, Antoninus began thinking more and more about succession, legacy, and the inevitability of death. It was during these later years that Antoninus became especially preoccupied with ensuring that his chosen heir, Marcus Aurelius, would be ready to take the throne. From the very beginning of his reign, Antoninus had treated Marcus with deep care and affection, almost as though he were his own son. By the 150s, Marcus had matured into a philosopher-statesman of rare depth. His devotion to Stoicism, his tireless study of law and governance, and his calm temperament made him an ideal successor in Antoninus' eyes. Together with Lucius Verus, who had also been adopted into the imperial family, Antoninus ensured that the future of Rome would be guided by men prepared for the immense burden of rule. To the Senate and the people of Rome, Antoninus' commitment to the principle of succession by merit, rather than blood, was another example of his wisdom. Where past emperors had been consumed by family intrigue, Antoninus prioritized stability and competence, securing Rome's future beyond his own lifetime. In his final years, Antoninus continued to reinforce his reputation as a protector of justice. Roman law under his guidance became more humane, more balanced, and more protective of the vulnerable. His edicts defending slaves against abusive masters, his insistence that accused individuals could not be executed without trial, and his commitment to fairness in taxation reflected not only his personal morality, but also the Stoic belief in the equality of all rational beings. This was not simply legal reform. It was a moral vision of governance that elevated Rome's empire into a model of justice admired across the ancient world. Even Christian writers, often hostile to Roman emperors, later acknowledged that Antoninus' reign had been one of relative tolerance, moderation, and fairness. In Antoninus, they saw a ruler who, though not one of their own, embodied a sense of divine justice in his stewardship of the empire. The peace Antoninus preserved was also a hallmark of his twilight years. No new wars were launched. No reckless campaigns of expansion were attempted. Instead, Rome's frontiers were maintained and defended with quiet vigilance. On the northern frontier in Britain, Antoninus had authorized the construction of a new defensive line, the Antonine Wall, stretching across Scotland between the Forth and Clyde rivers. Though ultimately abandoned in later decades, the wall was a testament to Antoninus' desire to strengthen Rome's defenses and consolidate its power without embarking on dangerous conquests. Similarly, in the east, Antoninus kept a watchful eye on Parthia, ensuring that diplomacy rather than conflict remained the guiding principle. The empire, under his stewardship, had entered one of its most stable phases, free from the crises and upheavals that had marred earlier centuries. Yet the passing years also deepened Antoninus' philosophical reflections. Though not a philosopher like Marcus Aurelius, Antoninus lived by Stoic principles of duty, moderation, and acceptance of fate. He understood that death was the natural end of all things, and he prepared himself for it without fear or anxiety. Accounts of his character describe him as a man serene in the face of mortality, convinced that his legacy would endure not through monuments or wars, but through the justice of his reign and the strength of the institutions he had preserved. For Antoninus, the greatness of an emperor was measured not by the number of provinces conquered, but by the stability and prosperity he left to his people. In 160 CE, Antoninus' health began to fail more noticeably. The strain of age and years of responsibility weakened him, and he began spending more time at Lorium, attended by Marcus Aurelius and members of his family. When the time came in March of 161 CE, Antoninus met his end with the same dignity that had marked his life. Ancient sources recount that as death approached, he called for the golden statue of fortune to be passed to Marcus Aurelius, symbolizing the transfer of power and the trust he placed in his successor. His final words, according to tradition, were simple but profound: equanimity. This single word encapsulated the essence of Stoic philosophy: calm acceptance of fate, serenity in the face of death, and a reminder that all things are fleeting. The death of Antoninus Pius marked the end of an era. For 23 years, he had ruled Rome without bloodshed, without civil war, and without the paranoia that had consumed so many emperors before him. His reign was a beacon of stability in the long history of the Roman Empire. The Senate mourned him deeply, and the people of Rome wept for a ruler who had lived simply, acted justly, and governed with patience. He was deified by the Senate, joining the ranks of the gods as Divus Antoninus. Temples and altars were dedicated to his memory, and coins were minted in his honor, inscribed with the words Divo Antonino. His wife, Faustina the Elder, who had died earlier, was already deified, and together the divine couple represented an ideal of harmony and virtue in Roman imperial propaganda. The legacy of Antoninus Pius extended far beyond his lifetime. His reign provided the crucial foundation upon which Marcus Aurelius would later govern. When Marcus faced the great crises of war, plague, and invasion, he often looked back to the example of Antoninus' steady hand and unyielding sense of justice. Marcus himself, in his meditations, paid tribute to Antoninus as a model of virtue, patience, and devotion to duty. He praised Antoninus for his calmness, his sense of responsibility, and his refusal to be carried away by anger, vanity, or ambition. For Marcus, Antoninus was not only a predecessor, but also a living embodiment of Stoic ideals put into practice. Historians have often debated the true significance of Antoninus' reign. Some argue that his era of peace masked deeper problems, growing pressures on the frontiers, economic strains, and challenges that would soon erupt under Marcus Aurelius. Others maintain that Antoninus' long and peaceful principate was precisely what Rome needed, allowing it to recover and strengthen before facing the storms to come. Whatever interpretation one accepts, it is undeniable that Antoninus Pius was one of Rome's most virtuous and honorable emperors. In an empire so often torn apart by greed, ambition, and bloodshed, his reign stood out as a reminder that justice, moderation, and discipline could hold the empire together as firmly as legions and conquests. As the sun set on the reign of Antoninus Pius, the Roman world remembered him not with fear, as they had remembered Domitian, nor with awe, as they had remembered Augustus, but with affection and respect. He was a ruler who embodied the qualities of a true guardian of the empire: pious, just, and devoted to the welfare of his people. His memory lingered for generations as the model of what a Roman emperor could be when guided by duty rather than ambition, humility rather than arrogance, and justice rather than cruelty. Antoninus Pius had lived a life true to his name: pious, the dutiful one, the man of principle, the emperor who ruled with honor. And though centuries would pass and empires would rise and fall, the story of his reign would remain a shining example of how peace, justice, and wisdom could define an age of greatness.